In the depths of a city forgotten by time, there is a hospital that carries a heavy burden of dark stories. Opened in the early decades of the 20th century, the São Gabriel Hospital was, for many years, a symbol of hope and healing for the local community. Its walls witnessed births, miraculous recoveries, but also, and mostly, despair and death. As the city began to decline, the hospital also succumbed to decay until it was completely abandoned. The building, once imposing, now stood like a skeleton of past times, with broken windows resembling empty eyes and corridors where silence reigned absolute, interrupted only by the occasional sound of rats and the wind whistling through the cracks. The air around the hospital seemed heavier, laden with an oppressive energy that made even the most skeptical hesitate to approach. Over the years, locals whispered stories about the hospital. They spoke of lights flickering at night, shadows moving in the third-floor windows, and distant screams echoing in the silence of the early morning. Few dared to approach the place, and those who did rarely returned without a terrifying story to tell. Among these stories, one stood out as the legend that in the hospital's final days, doctors performed cruel and unethical experiments on vulnerable patients. These procedures, conducted in secret, were said to have opened doors to something much darker than mere death. Many believed that the souls of the patients who died there never found peace and that instead, they remained trapped within the hospital's walls, condemned to eternally relive their suffering. Driven by an almost insatiable curiosity, Rodrigo, a young paranormal investigator, decided it was time to uncover the truth behind these stories. Rodrigo had always been fascinated by the supernatural, and after years of study and small investigations, he believed he was ready to face the secrets of São Gabriel Hospital. Equipped with recording devices, flashlights, and stubborn courage, he set off on a moonless night, determined to document the hospital's mysteries. Upon reaching the main entrance, Rodrigo paused for a moment, contemplating the building before him. The rusted iron gate, once robust, was now ajar as if inviting those brave or foolish enough to enter. He pushed the gate, which opened with a loud and ominous creak, echoing through the night. Every step he took toward the entrance seemed to be swallowed by the darkness surrounding the place. Rodrigo began his exploration of the abandoned hospital with a chill running down his spine, advancing through dark corridors filled with debris that bore witness to the place's grim past. The atmosphere was oppressive, with subtle sounds and whispers that made him feel as if he was being watched. While investigating an abandoned operating room, marked by dried blood and rusty instruments, he heard a distant groan that heightened his sense of danger. With every step, the tension grew, making it clear that the hospital was beginning to reveal its secrets, and that something dark was watching him. Leaving the operating room behind, Rodrigo felt an urgent need to understand more about what had happened in that hospital before its closure. The shadows he had seen and the inexplicable sounds were clear signs that there was something deeply disturbing in the bowels of that place. Determined to find clues that could shed light on the mystery, he headed to what he presumed to be the old medical records room. After exploring several corridors, he found a sturdy door marked with the faded inscription, "Medical Records." As he pushed it open, the door creaked ominously, revealing a space crammed with tall shelves filled with dusty folders and papers yellowed by time. The room was immersed in an almost oppressive silence, broken only by Rodrigo's slow and careful footsteps. He began sifting through the shelves, pulling out old folders and opening boxes containing records of patients who had passed through the hospital over the years. Each document told a story, a name, a date, a medical condition, but there was something more. As Rodrigo examined the records, he noticed a disturbing pattern. Many patients seemed to have been subjected to experimental treatments that were uncommon for the time. One record, in particular, caught his attention. It belonged to a patient named Maria Antonia, admitted with a simple fever, but who, inexplicably, never left the hospital. The document suggested that she had been transferred to a special wing, a place where alternative treatments were performed. The description of the procedures done on Maria was vague, but the few details indicated something dark and unethical. Rodrigo continued to dig through the files and discovered that it wasn't just Maria who had suffered such treatments. There were dozens of similar records, all of patients who never left the hospital, always with a final note indicating missing or died under unknown circumstances. A disturbing image began to form in his mind. The doctors at São Gabriel Hospital appeared to have used patients as guinea pigs for experiments, practices that resembled torture, under the guise of medical treatment. The air in the records room seemed to grow heavier as he leafed through the documents. Rodrigo felt a growing sense of dread, as if the walls were impregnated with the memories of suffering from those who had been treated as nothing more than study objects. He wondered if the experiments had been the cause of the hospital's haunting, if the souls of the patients had remained trapped there, unable to rest due to the injustice and torment they had suffered. As he continued reading, one document in particular made his blood run cold. It was a letter written by one of the hospital's chief doctors to an unidentified recipient. The letter mentioned Wing 4, an area of the hospital that was not listed in any other records. According to the letter, Wing 4 was where the most promising experiments were being conducted, and it was a secret kept even from most of the hospital's staff. Rodrigo knew he needed to find this hidden wing. If there really was a secret wing where the worst horrors were carried out, this could be the epicenter of all the paranormal activity in the hospital. He gathered the most important documents, placed them in his backpack, and prepared to continue his exploration. Discovering Wing 4 could be the key to understanding what really happened at São Gabriel Hospital and perhaps finding a way to appease the restless souls that still wandered there. With the records in hand and a new determination, Rodrigo left the records room, more aware than ever that the hospital harbored terrible secrets, ready to be uncovered. Every step he took now brought him closer to an inevitable confrontation with the forces that still inhabited that dark place. Carrying the documents he had just discovered, Rodrigo left the records room, his heart heavy with the disturbing revelations he had read. He knew that his next mission was to find the enigmatic Wing 4 mentioned in the records. However, as he advanced through the dark corridors of the hospital, the feeling of being watched became increasingly intense, almost palpable. He followed the mental map he had formed based on the information he had read. Wing 4 was supposed to be located somewhere at the back of the hospital, far from the main areas. The corridors became narrower, and the shadows seemed to elongate and distort, creating almost human forms that disappeared as soon as he looked directly at them. Suddenly, Rodrigo heard a distinct sound that made him stop abruptly. It was a slow, dragging shuffle, as if someone was walking heavily down a nearby corridor. He turned off his flashlight for a moment, holding his breath to listen more carefully. The sound continued, coming from an adjacent wing. His heart beat faster, and he felt a chill of fear run down his spine. Determined to discover the source of the noise, Rodrigo moved in the direction of the sound. Turning a corner, his flashlight captured a figure ahead, standing in the middle of the corridor. The beam of light revealed a woman, dressed in an old nurse's uniform, typical of the 1950s. Her face was partially obscured by disheveled hair, and her body seemed semi-transparent, as if it were made of mist. Rodrigo froze, unable to look away. The entity did not move, just remained there, with her head slightly tilted to the side, as if observing him. For a moment, time seemed to stop, and the air around him became cold. Then, the nurse lifted her head, revealing a pale face and empty eyes that emanated deep sadness. Before Rodrigo could react, the entity began to move slowly in his direction, her feet dragging on the floor with a disturbing sound. He felt his body panic, the instinct to flee screaming at him, but something kept him rooted in place. It was as if the very presence of the entity had a paralyzing power over him. When the nurse was just a few meters away, she stopped and extended a trembling hand toward him. Rodrigo felt a wave of extreme cold envelop his body, and his mind was flooded with an overwhelming sense of pain and despair, not his own, but the entity's. It was as if he was experiencing, for a brief moment, the suffering that tormented soul carried. Dominated by the instinct of survival, Rodrigo fled desperately from the ghostly nurse, feeling her steps echoing in his mind. As he moved away and felt safe, he realized that the entity was not just a vision but a real and painful presence, with intentions of its own. Understanding that he was facing something far more dangerous and dark than he had imagined, He decided that he needed to continue his exploration and discover the truth about the hospital, knowing that he must be prepared for the horrors that still awaited him. After the disturbing encounter with the ghostly nurse, Rodrigo knew he was dealing with forces far beyond what he had expected. The experience had shaken him, but it also made him more determined to understand what was really happening in that hospital. He took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure, and decided that he needed to delve even deeper into the investigation. If there was any truth to be found, it was hidden in the darkest and most inaccessible corners of São Gabriel Hospital. Guided by the records he had discovered and the mention of the mysterious Wing 4, Rodrigo began to explore the lesser-known areas of the hospital. He avoided the main wings and focused on forgotten corridors, side passages, and staircases leading to the basement. As he advanced, the sense of isolation and oppression grew, and the air seemed heavier, laden with a metallic smell he could not identify. After exploring several corridors that ended in dead ends, Rodrigo found a metal door, worn by time, at the end of a corridor that seemed to lead to a subterranean part of the hospital. The door was locked, but with some effort, he managed to force the lock with an iron bar he had found along the way. The door opened with a loud creak, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. Rodrigo turned on his flashlight and began to descend, each step creaking under his feet. The staircase seemed endless, and the silence around him was almost total, except for the sound of his own breathing and the faint echo of his footsteps. When he finally reached the bottom, he found himself in a narrow corridor, illuminated only by the dim light of his flashlight. The walls were covered with moisture, and the feeling of being watched was even more intense down there. He advanced slowly through the corridor, which seemed to stretch infinitely until he finally found a door marked with a sign that read Wing 4. The name was partially erased but still legible. Rodrigo felt a mix of anxiety and determination. He knew he was about to enter the darkest and most secret part of the hospital, where the cruelest and most unethical experiments were likely conducted. When he opened the door, he was greeted by a cold air and oppressive darkness. His flashlight revealed a large underground space, divided into several small rooms, all with heavy metal doors. The rooms were equipped with stretchers, restraint chairs, and old medical equipment, all covered in dust and rust. However, what caught his attention the most was the state of the walls, covered with deep scratches. As if someone or something had desperately tried to escape, Rodrigo began to explore each of the rooms, and what he found left him disgusted and horrified. There were medical records and hasty notes describing procedures that went beyond any medical ethics. Experiments involving electroshock, surgeries without anesthesia, and extreme isolation were common there. The patients were treated as study objects, with no respect for their dignity or life. As he read these notes, Rodrigo realized that most of the patients admitted they never left. Their fates were described in a cold, clinical manner: failed procedure, patient did not survive, unknown fate. These dry terms concealed a terrible truth. The lives of these people were cut short in the name of a distorted and immoral science. It was then that Rodrigo found a particularly disturbing document, a letter written by the hospital director, justifying the experiments as necessary for the advancement of medicine. He mentioned that the hospital was dealing with a malevolent force that needed to be contained, and that the experiments were an attempt to understand and control this force. This partially explained the origin of the entities that haunted the place, the souls of those who were sacrificed to combat a greater evil but ended up trapped in a cycle of pain and suffering. As he finished reading, Rodrigo heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from one of the rooms at the back. It was a low cry, almost a lament, repeating at regular intervals. He felt a chill run down his spine but knew he had to check what was happening. Guided by the sound, he approached the last room at the end of the corridor. When he opened the door, he saw something that made him recoil in shock. In the center of the room, there was an indistinct figure, floating slightly above the ground. It was the shadow of a patient, the contours of the body blurred, as if being undone by the very malevolent energy that kept it trapped there. The lament Rodrigo had heard before was clearly coming from this figure, a soul condemned to eternally relive its pain. Rodrigo realized that as long as he remained in Wing 4, he would be subject to the same fate as all the others. He needed to leave before it was too late, but he also knew that he now possessed crucial information that could finally explain what was happening in the hospital. With a heavy heart and a troubled mind, he left the room and returned to the corridor, determined to survive and tell the world about the horrors he had discovered in São Gabriel Hospital. Leaving Wing 4 with his heart still racing and his mind filled with disturbing images, Rodrigo knew there was more to discover in that hospital. The horrors he had encountered in the basement were only part of the mystery, and he couldn't stop thinking about the documents that mentioned a forbidden room. Something about that term evoked a sense of imminent danger, but also an irresistible curiosity. Guided by the information he had read in the records, Rodrigo began searching for this specific room, vaguely mentioned in letters and notes from the former doctors. According to the documents, the forbidden room was a place that should remain locked at all costs, and even the hospital staff avoided talking about it. The only concrete detail he had was that the room was located on the 3rd floor, an area he had previously avoided due to the intensity of paranormal activities he had already experienced on the other floors. With cautious steps, Rodrigo climbed the stairs leading to the 3rd floor. The atmosphere there felt different, denser, as if the very air was laden with an energy that pressed him back. The corridor on the 3rd floor was darker, with broken or missing light fixtures, and Rodrigo's flashlight seemed less effective at combating the darkness surrounding him. After walking for a few minutes, he reached the end of a corridor where a door caught his attention. It was a massive metal door, different from any other he had encountered in the hospital. On its surface, deep scratches and dark stains suggested that something or someone had tried to force it, both from the inside and the outside. There was no plaque indicating the room number, only a sense of weight and discomfort emanating from it. Rodrigo hesitated for a moment, knowing that crossing that door could mean a point of no return. However, the need to understand what was really happening in that hospital was stronger than the fear. He reached out and, with effort, turned the rusty handle. The door opened with a loud and prolonged groan, revealing the interior of the room. What he found inside surpassed all his expectations of horror. The room was small and dimly lit, with walls covered in strange and disturbing symbols, drawn with something that looked like blood. In the center of the room, there was a bed, but not an ordinary bed. It was a restraint bed, with worn and rusted straps that suggested someone or something had been kept there for a long time. Above the bed hung a chain holding a medallion, similar to the one he had found in Wing 4. As he approached, Rodrigo noticed that the medallion was engraved with the same symbols as the walls. He felt a chill as he observed the object, which seemed to emit a faint vibration, as if it were pulsing with energy. Suddenly, a loud banging sound echoed through the room, making Rodrigo turn sharply. The banging was coming from the walls and seemed to be coming from all directions at once. He felt his heart race as an invisible force began pressing down on him, as if the room were closing in around him. The air became heavier, making it difficult to breathe, and the light from his flashlight started to flicker uncontrollably. As the banging grew louder and the atmosphere became more oppressive, Rodrigo realized that something was trying to break free. He backed away, but before he could leave, a nebulous figure began to materialize beside the bed. It was an indistinct figure, composed of shadows and mist, with a face twisted in agony. The entity, trapped in that room for an undetermined time, seemed to be trying to communicate, but its voice was only a raspy and desperate whisper. Rodrigo felt a panic rising within him, but he knew he couldn't simply flee without understanding what that entity wanted. Taking a deep breath, he tried to establish a mental connection, trying to grasp what the figure was trying to convey. He began to understand that the room was not just a place of confinement but a portal, a place where the forces haunting the hospital were kept under control, but at a terrible cost. What had been trapped there was a powerful and malevolent force, something the hospital's doctors had tried to contain but had failed to fully understand. The entity, in its desperation, was trapped between worlds, unable to leave but also incapable of finding peace. Rodrigo realized that the medallion was the key to sealing or freeing this force, but he didn't know which choice was the right one. As the banging intensified and the entity became more agitated, Rodrigo made a quick decision. With a sudden movement, He tore the medallion from the chain, and in that instant, the energy in the room shifted. The banging ceased, and the entity let out an agonizing scream before disappearing into a cloud of mist that dissipated into the air. The silence that followed was absolute, but the sense of danger still lingered in the air. Rodrigo, holding the medallion tightly, quickly left the room, closing the door behind him. He knew he had done something important, but he still didn't fully understand the implications of what had just happened. The forbidden room held secrets beyond comprehension, and Rodrigo felt that the next step would be to discover how to deal with what he had unleashed. With the medallion firmly grasped in his hand, Rodrigo descended the stairs from the 3rd floor, feeling that the atmosphere around him was even more charged with tension. The hospital seemed to be alive, responding to what he had just done in the forbidden room. He knew he had unleashed something, but he didn't fully understand what it was or the consequences of that act. Now, more than ever, he needed to understand the true secret that the hospital was hiding. Back in the main corridor, Rodrigo decided to return to the records room, where he hoped to find more clues. Upon arriving there, he began to sift through the documents he had left behind, searching for any mention of the medallion or the rituals that had been performed in the hospital. That was when he found a diary, hidden under a pile of yellowed papers, that seemed to belong to the hospital director, Dr. Augusto Ferreira. The diary was in poor condition, with worn pages and faded ink, but still legible. Rodrigo began to read Dr. Ferreira's frantic notes, and the truth he discovered was even more terrifying than he could have imagined. The diary began with routine descriptions of the hospital's operation, but as Rodrigo advanced in his reading, the entries became increasingly disturbing. Dr. Ferreira wrote about the arrival of a particular patient, an unidentified man brought in by military forces under express orders to keep him a secret. The man, who had no name in the records, was gravely injured and suffering from an inexplicable condition that seemed to involve paranormal symptoms. The director reported that the patient was the source of a powerful and uncontrollable supernatural energy. He described how, as time passed, the hospital began to experience inexplicable phenomena: flickering lights, drastic temperature changes, and the feeling that something dark was growing within the building. The patient seemed to be a catalyst for these events, and the hospital's doctors, led by Dr. Ferreira, began conducting experiments to try to understand and eventually contain this force. It was at this point that the diary revealed the hospital's darkest secret. The experiments were not just to treat the patient, but to try to manipulate and control the supernatural energy emanating from him. The hospital had become a testing ground for rituals and occult practices that the doctors believed could tame the force haunting the patient. They used other patients as guinea pigs, sacrificing lives in a desperate effort to comprehend what they were facing. Dr. Ferreira, in his final notes, seemed to be on the brink of madness. He wrote about the growing fear he felt towards the force they were trying to control. In one of the last entries, he mentioned the medallion Rodrigo had found, describing it as an anchor, an object created to seal the force within the hospital, preventing it from spreading to the outside world. The medallion was supposed to be kept in the forbidden room, bound by chains, so its energy would remain contained. However, the diary ended abruptly, with an unfinished entry suggesting that Dr. Ferreira had failed in his attempt. The last line, written in an almost illegible scrawl, read, "We cannot control it. Seal the hospital. It is the only way." Rodrigo realized that the director had realized too late the fatal mistake they had made. The supernatural force could not be controlled, and now it was free. Rodrigo closed the diary with trembling hands. The truth was clear. The hospital was not just haunted by the spirits of dead patients, but by something much older and more malevolent. Something the doctors had tried to use for their own purposes and had failed terribly. What they had unleashed in the hospital was beyond human comprehension. And now, with the medallion out of its original position, this force was completely free to manifest. Rodrigo knew he couldn't just leave the hospital without doing something to contain what he had unleashed. The only hope was to find a way to reverse the process, to seal the force again. However, he no longer had time. The hospital was alive, and he could feel the entities moving, preparing for something. He needed to act quickly, before it was too late for him and for everyone outside that cursed hospital. With the diary in one hand and the medallion in the other, Rodrigo prepared for the final stage of his journey. He knew he couldn't escape his destiny. He would have to confront the hospital's dark force and try to seal it back, or perish in the process. With the weight of the diary and the medallion in his hands, Rodrigo knew he was about to face the greatest challenge of his life. The revelations he had just read made it clear that São Gabriel Hospital was the epicenter of a supernatural force that had been accidentally unleashed. Now, he needed to confront this force and attempt to seal it again, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. The environment around him felt more hostile, as if the very walls were closing in on him. Rodrigo took a deep breath and began to walk down the corridor, trying to devise a plan. The energy in the hospital seemed to have intensified, and the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. He knew that the entities inhabiting the place were aware of his presence and his intentions, and they would likely do everything they could to stop him. As he approached the staircase leading back to the basement, where he had found Wing 4, Rodrigo began to hear disturbing sounds, murmurs and wails that seemed to come from all directions. The voices whispered incomprehensible words, but the tone was clear. They didn't want him to proceed. Each step he took felt heavier, as if the ground was trying to hold him in place. When he finally reached the corridor of Wing 4, the shadows around him began to move in a disquieting way. Spectral figures emerged from the walls, their nebulous outlines distorted by the darkness. These were the spirits of the patients who had been sacrificed in the experiments, their souls trapped in an endless cycle of pain. Rodrigo felt a wave of panic, but he knew he had to keep going. He raised the medallion, hoping it might somehow ward them off, but the entities did not retreat. The figures began to close in, their expressions of agony and despair becoming more and more visible. Rodrigo felt a growing pressure in his mind, as if they were trying to invade his thoughts, filling him with visions of their horrific deaths and the cruel experiments they had endured. He struggled to maintain control, repeating to himself that he needed to keep moving forward, that the hospital's fate depended on his actions. Suddenly, an invisible force struck him violently, slamming him against the wall. The impact left him dazed, and he felt the medallion slip from his hands, falling to the floor with a metallic clink that echoed down the corridor. The entities closed in even more, and Rodrigo realized he was surrounded. The voices grew louder, like a chorus of torment that seemed to tear at his sanity. With one final effort, Rodrigo stood up and grabbed the medallion again. He knew he had to act fast. The diary had mentioned that the medallion was the key to sealing the malevolent force, but there were no clear instructions on how to do so. In a moment of desperation, he decided to follow his instincts. With the medallion in hand, he ran back to the forbidden room, where he had encountered the previous entity. The entities followed him, moving with frightening speed. Rodrigo knew he didn't have much time. When he reached the room, he forced the door open and entered, closing it behind him. The room seemed even darker than before, and the malevolent energy emanating from it was almost suffocating. Rodrigo knew this was the place where he needed to do whatever it took to seal the force. He approached the bed in the center of the room, where the medallion had originally been attached. He placed the medallion back on its chain and, with trembling hands, began to recite the words he had read in the diary. The entities began to pound on the door, and the sound was deafening, as if the hospital itself was trying to stop what he was doing. As Rodrigo recited the words, the energy in the room began to shift. The shadows around him seemed to writhe and retreat, and the pressure in his mind began to lessen. He felt an invisible force trying to pull him away from the bed, but he held on tightly to the chain, continuing to recite the words with all the strength he could muster. Finally, the last word was spoken, and a wave of energy swept through the room. The medallion glowed with an intense light, and Rodrigo was thrown backward by the force of the explosion. The entities let out shrill screams and disappeared, their nebulous forms being sucked into the medallion. The room fell silent, and the atmosphere, once oppressive, was now strangely calm. Rodrigo lay on the floor for a few moments, trying to process what had just happened. He slowly stood up, feeling his body tremble with exhaustion. The medallion, now glowing with a soft light, was back in its original position, sealing the force that had been unleashed. He knew that, although he had managed to seal the force, the hospital still bore the scars of what had happened there. The souls of the patients were still trapped, but now, with the malevolent force contained, there might be a chance for them to find peace. With one last look at the room, Rodrigo left the medallion where it was and exited, closing the door behind him. The confrontation was over, but the memories of what he had experienced there would stay with him forever. With the final confrontation seemingly resolved, Rodrigo felt a wave of relief mixed with exhaustion. He had succeeded in sealing the malevolent force that haunted the hospital, but he knew he was still not completely safe. The entities that had pursued him may have been temporarily contained, but the sense of danger persisted. He knew he needed to leave the hospital as quickly as possible before anything else happened. With quick and cautious steps, Rodrigo left the forbidden room and began to descend the stairs, returning to the lower floors. The silence was now almost absolute, but this did not reassure him. On the contrary, the silence seemed to foreshadow something he could not understand. His flashlight, which had previously cut through the darkness effectively, now seemed to have its light dimmed, as if the very darkness was trying to swallow any trace of light. As he crossed the corridors toward the exit, Rodrigo began to notice that the hospital seemed to have changed. The walls, once firm and stable, now seemed distorted, as if the building was alive and trying to close in on him. Doors that were once open were now locked or simply disappeared, and the corridors seemed to stretch out indefinitely. He quickened his pace, trying to stay calm, but each time he turned a corner or tried to open a door, something prevented his progress. The hospital, which had previously allowed his entry, now seemed determined to keep him trapped. Rodrigo felt the panic start to rise. He needed to find a way out, but the exits were disappearing. Reaching the main lobby, where he expected to find the front door, he was met with a disturbing sight. The door was blocked by debris that seemed to have fallen from the ceiling, preventing any attempt at escape that way. He tried to move the debris, but it was too heavy to shift alone. Desperate, he looked around, searching for another way out. It was then that he heard a sound coming from behind him, slow, dragging footsteps echoing through the empty lobby. Rodrigo turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in his hand, and saw something that made his heart freeze. The entities, which he believed he had sealed, were materializing again. They emerged from the shadows, their faces contorted in expressions of agony and anger, as if they were still trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. Rodrigo knew he couldn't face them again. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The only option was to flee, to find an exit before the entities reached him. He ran down the side corridor, searching for a window or an emergency door, anything that would lead him out of that nightmare. The footsteps behind him grew louder, as if the entities were picking up speed, determined not to let him escape. The panic in his chest grew with every second, and he began to doubt whether he would make it out alive. Every door he tried was locked, every window was sealed. The hospital was turning into a deadly maze, and Rodrigo was trapped at its center. Finally, as he turned another corner, he found an emergency exit, its red light faintly glowing at the end of the corridor. With his heart racing, he ran toward the door, feeling the entities getting closer and closer. When he reached the door, he pushed with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. The door was jammed, as if the hospital itself was trying to hold him back. Rodrigo looked back and saw the shadows closing in on him, the entities now close enough that he could feel the cold emanating from them. With one last desperate effort, he kicked the door, and to his surprise, it opened with a loud crack. He dashed outside, feeling the cool night air envelop him as the door slammed shut behind him. He stumbled away from the hospital, breathing heavily and trying to calm his heart that seemed ready to burst. When he finally stopped at a safe distance from the building, he looked back and saw the hospital lights flickering irregularly, as if the structure itself was struggling against the forces that had been unleashed. Rodrigo knew he had escaped by a narrow margin, but the sense of danger had not completely dissipated. He knew that the hospital remained a cursed place, and that the dark forces he had faced were still present, even if temporarily contained. But for now, he was safe. He had survived the nightmare of São Gabriel Hospital, but the scars of what he experienced there would stay with him forever. With one last look at the hospital, Rodrigo turned and began to walk away, determined to leave that place behind. He knew his life would never be the same, and that the stories he would tell about that night would be both a warning and a reminder that some secrets are best left buried.